We do not remember days, we remember moments. There's a memory you carry. You know the one. It might be 10 years old, or 20, or just a few months, but it's there, isn't it? Sitting in the back of your mind like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. You've tried to forget it. You've tried to move on. You've buried it under new experiences, new relationships, and new versions of yourself. And yet, when you're alone at night, or driving in silence, or standing in the shower, there it is again. Vivid, visceral, as real as the day it happened. Why won't it fade? That's what I want to explore in this video. Not just the neuroscience of memory, though we'll touch on that. Not just the psychology of trauma, though that's certainly part of it. But something deeper. Something more fundamental about what it means to be human, to carry the weight of our past into our present, and to wonder whether we're haunted by our memories, or whether, in some strange way, we're choosing to hold on to them. Let me start with a question that might seem obvious, but isn't. What is a memory? We tend to think of memories as recordings, like video files stored in the hard drive of our brain. We imagine that when we remember something, we're simply pressing play, watching the same scene unfold exactly as it happened. But that's not how memory works at all. Every time you remember something, you're not retrieving a file. You're reconstructing an event. Your brain is taking fragments, a smell, an emotion, a face, a sound, and weaving them back together into something that feels like a coherent narrative. And here's the unsettling part. Every time you reconstruct that memory, you change it slightly. You add new context. You emphasize different details. You color it with your current emotional state. Which means the memory that refuses to fade isn't even the original memory anymore. It's a memory of a memory of a memory, revised and edited countless times, until what you're holding on to is something your mind has crafted, a story you keep telling yourself about who you were and what happened. So why do some memories persist while others dissolve into nothing? Think about your childhood. You lived thousands of days and experienced countless moments. Where did they all go? Why can you remember, with perfect clarity, the time you were humiliated in front of your class in 3rd grade, but you can't remember what you ate for breakfast last Tuesday? Why does your mind hold on to certain moments with such fierce intensity while letting others slip away like water through your fingers? The answer lies in emotion, specifically in the way emotional intensity acts like a chemical stamp on certain experiences, marking them as significant, as worthy of preservation. When something happens that triggers a strong emotional response, fear, shame, joy, or grief, your brain floods with stress hormones and neurotransmitters. These chemicals don't just make you feel something in the moment, they literally strengthen the neural pathways associated with that experience. This is why trauma memories are so persistent. This is why the worst moments of your life, the betrayals, the losses, the humiliations, seem to have been engraved into your consciousness with a hot iron. Your brain, in its misguided attempt to protect you, has decided these memories are important. It has marked them as lessons you must not forget. But here's where it gets interesting, and where we need to look beyond just the mechanics of memory. Because the question isn't just why certain memories persist. The question is, why do we continue to revisit them? You've probably noticed this pattern in your own life. The memory that refuses to fade isn't just sitting there passively. You actively return to it. In quiet moments, your mind wanders back to that scene, replaying it, analyzing it, wondering what you could have done differently. It's like pressing on a bruise to see if it still hurts. And it always does. This is where we need to talk about rumination. Rumination is the process of repetitively thinking about the same thing, usually something negative or distressing. It's the mental equivalent of a dog worrying a bone, turning it over and over, gnawing at it, never quite letting it go. And rumination is one of the primary ways we keep certain memories alive long past their natural expiration date. Why do we do this to ourselves? If the memory is painful, if revisiting it causes us distress, why do we keep going back? The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard wrote about repetition as a fundamental human need. We repeat experiences, he argued, not because we enjoy them, but because we're trying to master them. We're trying to understand them. We're trying to find meaning in them. When something happens that doesn't fit into our understanding of ourselves or the world, We can't simply file it away and move on. We have to work through it. We have to make sense of it. And so we return to the memory again and again, like a detective returning to a crime scene, looking for clues we might have missed. We replay the conversation, searching for the moment when everything went wrong. We relive the betrayal, trying to understand how we didn't see it coming. We resurrect the loss, attempting to find some way to integrate it into our story of who we are. But here's the problem. Sometimes there is no meaning to be found. Sometimes terrible things happen for no reason. Sometimes people hurt us not because we deserved it, but because they were hurt themselves. Sometimes we make mistakes, not because we're fundamentally flawed, but because we're human, and humans make mistakes. And when we can't find meaning, when we can't make sense of what happened, we get stuck. The memory becomes a loop we can't escape. We ruminate not because it's helpful, but because we don't know how to stop. Let me tell you about Sarah. She's not a real person, but she represents a pattern I've seen countless times. 20 years ago, when Sarah was in high school, she was sexually assaulted at a party. She never reported it. She never told anyone. She tried to forget it happened. She threw herself into her studies, went to college, built a career, got married, and had children. By all external measures, she moved on with her life. But the memory never faded. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger with time. Decades later, Sarah would find herself in the middle of a workday, suddenly unable to focus, her mind pulled back to that night. She would lie awake next to her sleeping husband, reliving every detail, every decision she made that led her to that party, and every moment she could have escaped. The memory had become a shadow self, a dark companion that followed her everywhere. What Sarah didn't understand, what took her years of therapy to begin to grasp, was that the memory persisted not just because of its emotional intensity, but because of what it represented. That night had shattered her sense of safety in the world. It had violated her understanding of herself as someone who had control over her own body and her own life, and she had never processed that violation. She had never grieved what was taken from her. She had never allowed herself to feel the full weight of her anger and her pain. Instead, she had tried to forget. She had tried to move on. She had tried to be strong. And in doing so, she had trapped the memory in a kind of suspended animation, preventing it from being integrated into her larger life narrative. The memory refused to fade because the wound it represented had never been allowed to heal. This brings us to something crucial: the difference between remembering and being haunted. When we remember something in a healthy way, we acknowledge what happened. We feel whatever emotions arise, and then we let it settle back into the larger context of our lives. The memory becomes part of our story, but it's not the whole story. It's a chapter, not the entire book. But when we're haunted by a memory, it's different. The memory takes on a kind of autonomous power. It intrudes on our present moment. It colors our perception of ourselves and others. It becomes a lens through which we interpret new experiences, often in distorted ways. We might find ourselves reacting to current situations not based on what's actually happening, but based on what that old memory has taught us to expect. If you were betrayed by someone you trusted, you might find yourself unable to fully trust anyone, constantly scanning for signs of deception, even in relationships with people who've given you no reason to doubt them. If you failed at something important, you might find yourself paralyzed by the fear of failure in new endeavors, even ones completely unrelated to the original experience. The memory has become a prison, and you're both the prisoner and the guard. So how do we escape? How do we allow the memory that refuses to fade to finally, gently lose its grip on us? The first step is understanding that the goal isn't to forget. You can't force yourself to forget something, and the attempt to do so usually has the opposite effect. It's like being told not to think about a white bear suddenly. That's all you can think about. The memory persists, partly because you're fighting so hard against it. Instead, the goal is integration. It's allowing the memory to become part of your larger story without letting it define the entire narrative. It's looking at what happened and saying, yes, this happened. Yes, it was painful. Yes, it changed me. And I am more than this moment. This is harder than it sounds. It requires you to actually sit with the memory instead of running from it. It requires you to feel the emotions you've been avoiding, the shame, the anger, the grief, and the fear. It requires you to stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and start asking, "What do I need to do now to move forward?" There's a therapeutic approach called exposure therapy that's built on this principle. For people with PTSD, the memory of their trauma has become so overwhelming that they'll do anything to avoid being reminded of it. They avoid places, people, situations, anything that might trigger the memory, and in doing so, they give the memory even more power. They teach their brain that the memory is dangerous, something to be feared. In exposure therapy, under the guidance of a trained therapist, the person gradually and safely confronts the memory. They tell the story of what happened, over and over, until it loses some of its emotional charge. They revisit the places or situations they've been avoiding, and slowly, the memory begins to integrate. It becomes less of an overwhelming emotional experience and more of a narrative, something that happened, that was difficult, but that no longer has the power to hijack the present moment. But integration isn't just about exposure. It's also about meaning-making. It's about finding a way to understand what happened that allows you to move forward. This doesn't mean justifying what happened or pretending it wasn't that bad. It means finding some way to make sense of it within your larger life story. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, wrote about this in his book Man's Search for Meaning. He observed that the prisoners in concentration camps who survived were often not the strongest or the healthiest, but those who had found some meaning in their suffering. They had found something to live for, a loved one they wanted to reunite with, a task they needed to complete, or a message they needed to share with the world. Frankl argued that we can't always control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond to it. We can choose what meaning we assign to our experiences, and in that choice lies our freedom. This is not about toxic positivity. This is not about pretending that everything happens for a reason, or that your suffering was somehow good for you. It's about acknowledging that you get to decide what role this experience plays in your life going forward. You get to decide whether it's a defining tragedy or a difficult chapter that led to growth. You get to decide whether it makes you bitter or compassionate. You get to decide whether it closes you off from the world or opens you up to deeper connections with others who have suffered. Let me give you an example. I once knew a man whose son died in a car accident. For years, he was consumed by grief and rage. The memory of getting that phone call, of identifying his son's body, of standing at the funeral, these memories haunted him constantly. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and couldn't find any joy in life. He became a shell of himself. And then, slowly, something shifted. He started volunteering with an organization that supported families who had lost children. He began speaking at high schools about the dangers of drunk driving. The driver who killed his son had been intoxicated. He created a scholarship fund in his son's name. He didn't forget his son. The pain didn't disappear, but he found a way to channel that pain into something meaningful. He found a way to let his son's death stand for something beyond just loss. The memories still came, but they were different now. They were no longer just scenes of trauma. They were also reminders of love, of the importance of the work he was doing, and of his son's continued presence in the world through the lives he touched. The memory had been integrated. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not saying everyone who suffered needs to turn their pain into a mission or a cause. That's one path, but it's not the only path. Integration can look like many different things. For some, it might mean creating art that expresses what they went through. For others, it might mean simply learning to sit with the memory without being overwhelmed by it. For still others, it might mean recognizing how the experience changed them, perhaps making them more empathetic, more resilient, and more aware of life's fragility and preciousness. The key is that integration gives you agency. Instead of being a passive victim of your memories, you become an active participant in shaping how those memories exist within your life. But there's another layer to this that we need to explore. Sometimes, the memory that refuses to fade isn't refusing to fade because it's unprocessed or unintegrated. Sometimes, we're holding on to it for a reason. Sometimes we need it. This might sound strange, but think about it. Our memories, even our painful ones, are part of our identity. They're proof that we lived, that we felt, that we mattered. Sometimes we hold on to a painful memory because letting it go feels like betraying someone we loved, or minimizing something that was important, or losing a part of ourselves. I once spoke with a woman whose mother had died when she was young. She carried vivid, painful memories of her mother's final days in the hospital. And while these memories caused her anguish, she was also terrified of forgetting them. Those memories were one of the few connections she still had to her mother. Letting them fade felt like losing her mother all over again. What she eventually came to understand was that she could honor her mother without clinging to the most painful memories. She could remember her mother's love, her mother's laugh, and the good times they shared. The hospital memories didn't have to be the primary way she stayed connected to her mother. She could choose which memories to cultivate and which ones to let soften around the edges. This is important. You're not required to forget. You're not required to get over anything. But you are allowed to choose which memories you feed, which ones you return to again and again, and which ones you gently release. There's also the question of identity. Sometimes we hold on to painful memories because they've become part of how we understand ourselves. If you've spent years thinking of yourself as the person this terrible thing happened to, letting go of that memory can feel like losing your identity. Who are you, if not the victim of this tragedy? Who are you, if not the person who survived this ordeal? This is the strange bargain we sometimes make with our pain. We let it define us in exchange for a coherent sense of self. We become the betrayed spouse, the abuse survivor, the person with the tragic past. And while these labels might be accurate, they're not complete. You are so much more than the worst thing that ever happened to you. Releasing that identity doesn't mean denying what happened. It means refusing to let what happened be the only thing that defines you. It means saying, yes, this happened to me. And I am also someone who loves, who creates, who laughs, who helps others, who has dreams and desires, and a future that isn't determined by my past. Let's talk about forgiveness for a moment. Not because you have to forgive anyone you don't, but because the question of forgiveness often arises when we're dealing with memories that won't fade, especially memories involving people who hurt us. There's a common misconception that forgiveness means excusing what someone did, or pretending it didn't hurt, or reconciling with the person who harmed you. But that's not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is about releasing yourself from the ongoing emotional burden of what happened. It's about saying, what you did was wrong, it hurt me, and I'm not going to carry the weight of that hurt anymore. You can forgive someone and still maintain boundaries. You can forgive someone and never speak to them again. You can forgive someone who never apologized, who doesn't even think they did anything wrong. Because forgiveness isn't really about them. It's about you choosing peace over resentment, freedom over bondage. The Buddhist teacher Jack Kornfield tells a story about forgiveness that I find helpful. He talks about how resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. When you hold on to anger and hurt, when you replay the memory of what someone did to you over and over, you're not hurting them, you're hurting yourself. They've moved on with their lives. They might not even remember what they did, but you're still there, in that moment, letting it poison your present. Forgiveness is the antidote to that poison, but it's not a one-time event. It's a practice. You might need to forgive the same person for the same thing 1,000 times before it finally takes hold. Each time the memory arises, each time you feel the anger or the hurt, you practice letting it go. Not suppressing it, not denying it, but acknowledging it and then choosing to release it. Now, some memories that refuse to fade aren't memories of things that happened to us, but things we did. These might be even harder to integrate because they challenge our self-concept. We like to think of ourselves as good people, and when we remember something we did that was hurtful or wrong or shameful, it creates a kind of cognitive dissonance. This is where self-compassion becomes crucial. Self-compassion doesn't mean letting yourself off the hook or pretending you didn't make a mistake. It means treating yourself with the same kindness you'd extend to a friend who made a mistake. It means recognizing that you're human, that you were doing the best you could with the resources and understanding you had at the time, and that your worth as a person isn't determined by your worst moment. The psychologist Kristen Neff, who studies self-compassion, talks about three components: self-kindness instead of self-judgment, common humanity instead of isolation, and mindfulness instead of over-identification. When you remember something you did that you're ashamed of, instead of beating yourself up about it, you acknowledge that everyone makes mistakes. You remind yourself that imperfection is part of the human experience. You hold the memory with awareness, but without letting it consume you. And here's something important. Holding on to shame doesn't prevent you from making the same mistake again. If anything, it makes it more likely, because shame makes us feel like bad people, and bad people do bad things. But if you can forgive yourself, if you can learn from what happened and make amends where possible, you're much more likely to act differently in the future. Let me bring this back to something concrete. What do you actually do when the memory comes? When you're lying in bed at night and suddenly you're back there, in that moment, feeling everything again. First, you notice. You observe that the memory has arisen. You don't try to push it away, and you don't dive into it completely. You maintain some psychological distance. You might even narrate it to yourself. Ah, there's that memory again. There's that feeling of shame. There's that familiar tightness in my chest. Second, you breathe, literally. Take a few deep breaths. This does something important. It signals to your nervous system that you're safe right now, in this moment. The memory is from the past. It's not happening now. Your body might be reacting as if it is, but breathing helps to regulate that response. Third, you ground yourself in the present. Look around the room. Notice 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. This technique, often used for anxiety, pulls you back into the now. You're not in that memory. You're here, in this room, in this moment. Fourth, you practice self-compassion. You might place a hand on your heart and say something kind to yourself. That was really hard. I'm sorry I went through that. Or, I made a mistake. I'm human. I'm learning. Find words that feel authentic to you. Fifth, you choose. You can choose to examine the memory if that feels helpful. Maybe there's something you need to understand or process, but you can also choose to let it go. You can imagine the memory as a cloud passing through the sky of your mind. You don't have to grab onto it. You can watch it drift by. And finally, you remind yourself of your wholeness. Yes, this thing happened, but you are not defined by it. You contain multitudes. You are the sum of countless experiences, countless moments, and countless versions of yourself. This memory is one thread in the vast tapestry of who you are. Over time, with practice, the memory begins to lose its charge. Not because you've forgotten it, but because you've changed your relationship to it. It no longer has the power to hijack your present moment. It's simply something that happened, something that was difficult, something that taught you something, perhaps, but not something that controls you. There's a concept in narrative therapy called externalizing the problem. Instead of saying, I am depressed, or I am anxious, you say, I'm experiencing depression, or anxiety is visiting me today. This subtle shift in language creates distance between you and the problem. You are not your depression. You are not your anxiety. You are a person who is experiencing these things. The same principle applies to memories. You are not your trauma. You are not your mistakes. You are not your shame. You are a person who experienced these things, who carried them for a while, and who is now learning to put them down. Let me tell you what integration looks like in the end. It doesn't mean you never think about what happened. It doesn't mean the memory completely fades. It means that when the memory arises, it no longer brings that overwhelming flood of emotion. It's more like a photograph you come across in an old box. You recognize the moment, you remember how you felt, but you're observing it from a distance. You can acknowledge it and then put it back in the box and go about your day. Integration means you can talk about what happened without falling apart. You can share your story with someone if you choose to, not because you're stuck in it, but because it's part of how you came to be who you are today. Integration means the memory has become wisdom. It's something you learned from, grew from, or maybe even something that made you more compassionate or resilient or aware. And here's the beautiful paradox. When you stop fighting the memory, when you stop trying so hard to forget it, when you stop being afraid of it, that's often when it begins to fade. Not all at once. Not completely, but it softens. It loses its sharp edges. It becomes part of the background rather than the overwhelming foreground. This is what healing looks like. Not the absence of pain, but the ability to carry pain without being destroyed by it. Not the erasure of memory, but the integration of memory into a larger, more complete story of who you are. I want to end with something important. If you're carrying a memory that refuses to fade, if it's impacting your daily life, your relationships, your ability to function, please consider seeking help. Talk to a therapist. Find a support group. There's no shame in needing help to process difficult experiences. In fact, seeking help is an act of courage. It's you saying, I deserve to feel better. I deserve to be free. You don't have to carry this alone, and you don't have to carry it forever. The memory that refuses to fade will fade in time when you're ready to let it, not because you've forgotten, but because you've remembered in a new way. Because you've taken what happened and woven it into the larger story of your life without letting it be the only story. Because you've reclaimed your right to exist beyond that moment, to be more than what happened to you or what you did. You are not your memories. You are the one who remembers. And in that distinction lies all the difference. You are the consciousness that observes, that feels, that grows, that changes. Memories come and go, but you remain. The essential you, the aware you, the you that exists independent of any single experience. So when that memory comes again, and it will come, greet it with compassion, thank it for trying to protect you, for marking something as important, and for carrying a message you needed to hear. And then, gently, let it know that you're okay now. You've heard the message. You've learned what you needed to learn. It can rest now. It can fade, slowly, peacefully, in its own time. And you can step forward into your life, carrying all that you've been through, but not defined by it, free to become whoever you're meant to be next. That's what it means to live with memories rather than being imprisoned by them. That's what it means to be human, to hurt, to heal, and to continue. The memory may never completely fade, but you will continue, and that, in itself, is a kind of victory.